I spent an awfully long time talking about the Buddha and telling the story of the Buddha and kind of getting us up to speed on who the Buddha was. And then from there we spoke a little bit about Buddhism, what Buddhism is, not in terms of its teachings, but in terms of how we might understand it objectively. Do we understand it as a religion, for example? Remains a hard question. I went back, I was thinking about my world cultures class in high school, and very clearly, I remember my teacher writing it on the board, religion teaches you where the world came from, why, and what happens after you die. In which case Buddhism is not a religion. None of these things are really that interesting from a Buddhist perspective. So if, again, it depends on the definition, but as I was remembering that, I was kind of laughing and thinking, wow, that's not even, we're not really covering any of the bases at all. Today what I want to do, though, is to get out of that kind of background story and talk about what the Buddha taught, or at least what we understand to be the foundational teachings of Buddhism. There are a lot of things, and I'm trying to make a list. There are things about Buddhism that I think we want to know, or that are kind of the fun conversations about Buddhism. You know, what are Buddhist ethics, for example? I think it's difficult to feel that we really understand what any religion is if we don't have that conversation. So we have to have that conversation. What is a Buddhist cosmology? What is the basic understanding of what reality looks like, what the world looks like? That conversation has to happen. What is Buddhist psychology? Because Buddhism is very interested in psychology, and you can't really separate that out from the rest. And then, of course, what is Buddhist practice? What does it look like to actually practice meditation? What does it look like to practice beyond meditation? What are the results of doing that? Right? And to a certain extent, how has Buddhism evolved? All of these things are really big topics that we cannot discuss in any depth at all until we have this conversation today, which is about a very, very few really interesting points that form the basis of all the rest of it. You cannot possibly understand Buddhist psychology without discussing this very short list of things. You can't discuss Buddhist cosmology without discussing these things because it won't make any sense. And if you do discuss these things, then actually you can go off in a cave if you want, and you can follow the pattern of thought that comes from these ideas and arrive at something very resonant with what we might call Buddhist psychology or Buddhist cosmology or whatever that is. So, today, what are the basic teachings of Buddhism? Well, starting with the caveat I offered last time, which is that we talk about this as what the Buddha taught. We don't really know, because who knows if the Buddha really said it or not. But this is what we have. There are 4, what we sometimes call seals, sometimes call the 4 aspects of existence that are kind of non-negotiable. Not that you have to believe them, and we talked about this last time as well, just because I'm saying them. Not that you even have to believe them in order to be Buddhist, but these are 4 questions or 4 challenges that you would take up in earnest, that you would investigate in your life as part of Buddhist practice. If these hold no interest for you at all, or if on the very surface of it you think these are wrong, probably Buddhism is not your thing. Just saying. And the first one, we can't really translate very well, is dukkha. Dukkha is the word that is so often translated as suffering. So you probably learned in high school or somewhere that Buddhists believe that all life is suffering. What the Buddha said was that all existence or all life is characterized by dukkha. So we have to talk about dukkha. And it gets a lot of press, not just because it sounds so depressing, but because it's the very first thing a according to the story, that the Buddha talked about at all. The story goes that after this whole experience that I talked about forever last time, he went and he found these 4 friends, right, who used to sit with him, thought he was a sellout, and then they came around, and then he opened his mouth, and when he opened his mouth, he said, there are 4 noble truths. The first one is that all life is characterized by dukkha. Dukkha. We know, first of all, that it can't be suffering in the sense of agony, right? Because we would just know right off that that's wrong, because no one here is grimacing in pain, and we aren't sobbing. So we know it has to be more subtle. Dukkha is a kind of discomfort. I often think of it as dissatisfaction, but it's a little bit beyond that. It's the sense of a gap. The gap between how things are and how you might possibly imagine they could be. Because we constantly carry both. That's our superpower, right? This is, I suspect, what separates us from cats. Is that cats see things primarily as they are, I think. Whereas we always look at reality and an alternate reality. And usually not just one alternate reality, but a multiverse of alternate realities. So, when it rains outside, we can imagine the day, the same day. Right? Today is the 9th, April 9th, is that right? Mm-hmm. So, we have the April 9th sunny day, but we are completely capable of also imagining the April 9th rainy day. And maybe truer to our experience, we have the April 9th still 10 feet of snow on the ground day. But we can simultaneously, as we walk the streets, superimpose on this day another day in which the snow is gone and Easter looked like Easter. Right? It's amazing, not just that we can do it, but that we kind of can't not do it. Now this is usually framed, this teaching, in terms of dissatisfaction, in the sense that we see something and we superimpose the better version onto it. Right? But it works in reverse as well, so that when everything is just right, when that day finally does come and the snow is gone and you step outside and the grass is green and the birds are singing, the first thing you'll think is, why can't it be like this all the time? Right? And so then you're measuring this reality against all of reality that doesn't seem to be measuring up. And it happens like that. And it happens constantly. And you eat a food and you think, it doesn't taste as good as last time. Or it doesn't taste the way I thought it would. This in Japanese is called shiryo. Shi means thinking, ryo means measuring. Right? And it's a word that comes up a lot. It's the aspect of our mind by which we hold up some sort of measuring stick. And we decide that something is big enough, or that it's comfy enough, right? Or that it's attractive enough. And usually it doesn't measure up. That's dukkha.
So would that be more our wants?
It's a good transition. I could have paid you to say that. Because.
Yes, you did.
That's right. Cute. Because after the Buddha said, everything is characterized by this experience of dukkha, he brought up number 2. And number 2 was that dukkha has a cause. And the cause, he said, was attachment. Sometimes we talk about this in terms of desire, but again, I think desire is not a useful. It's not a broad enough translation. That we hold to something. There's something we're clinging to, whether it is that the taste of how your grandmother made biscuits so that your biscuits never taste good enough, right? That's attachment, right? Or welcome. Or, you know, you look at your house and you think, you know what this house needs? It needs one more room. It's almost impossible to let go of that. Once you have it in your head, it becomes part of the story of that house. It becomes part of the narrative that you carry all the time. So that's attachment. And when we start noticing attachment, we start noticing that that's basically what we do. Attachment, to a great degree, is a synonym for dukkha itself. You can't really separate the two. Then he said, yes?
What's the mainstream word for the second noble truth? Is it desire or is it attachment? Or
You see it both ways.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what I first learned was that all life is suffering.
Yeah.
Suffering is caused by desire.
Yeah, okay.
The way out of desire is...
Good evening. Please join us for our program, Mindfulness and Resilience, promoting mental health in our community. The program will begin at 7 p.m. in the Paul O'Regan Hall on the ground floor. Everyone is welcome to attend.
Mindfulness?
I'm trying to balance the experience we just had with mindfulness. Wow. It was almost perfect. That the way out of suffering is the way beyond desire. Right? It's funny that it comes up as 4 because 3 is so obvious. Right? There's really no reason for us to have number 3. 3 is the clearest thing in the world. If A equals B and you want to get rid of B, you have to go after A. Right? That's all he's saying. And then he says that the way out of desire, the way beyond attachment, is what we commonly call the Noble Eightfold Path. And then in this moment, we have our fear confirmed, which is that Buddhism is obsessed with lists. Right? We get to the end of 4 only to start into 8, which then might lead us into the 12 and the 108. It goes on and on. And I'm going to tell you the list. But it's really fun to get a bunch of Buddhists in a room and say, Noble Eightfold Path, and everybody will start arguing and they can't remember. Almost nobody can get all 8. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. We could talk a long time just about what right means. But I think for our purposes we can understand it in a kind of, as its first hit, that there's something correct, there's something true about this. But obviously it's not that simple. It can't possibly be that simple. Also, though I just said understanding thought, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, all of these, like suffering and disappointment, like desire and attachment, they all have multiple translations that have found their way in. And so if you go look this up on Google, you'll find a list that is subtly different in lots of ways. This is the first one I found, and I think it's good enough. And to understand this Eightfold Path, we can understand it as a series. Not that we can't examine each one in any order, but there's a kind of a container for these that's referred to as the threefold trainings. So the first is in Sanskrit, shila, which is ethical conduct, or skillful means. It's our behavior in the world. And right speech, right action, and right livelihood are speaking to that aspect of our lives. So through our speech, through our action, through the choices that we make in terms of how we're relating to others, which is livelihood, how are we engaging with society, ourselves fit. Could I also ask you to turn on the light?
Yeah.
Now that we've done that. You make yourself fit for the next thing. And I've read in multiple places and had it pointed out to me that in the yoga world, if you're a yoga person, that this same path is laid out very clearly. That first you're establishing the physical. And then, beyond that, you reach, after Shila, there's samadhi. Samadhi is what we might understand as the meditative aspect, or the focus of the mind. Where are we putting our mind? This, within that Eightfold Path, right mindfulness, right effort, and right concentration. This is about our internal experience, the way in which we are setting our intention in the world. And that once we have established those two, our conduct and our mind, our mental state, and this would include, in yoga, it would also include the breathing, how you're holding your breathing. Then we get prajna, which is wisdom, or enlightened awareness. And this is the realm of right thought and right understanding. So if we're really taking this on, if we're going to follow the Eightfold Path intentionally, and I'm always speaking about this a little bit as an outsider, because in Zen Buddhism, we don't really talk about this very much in this kind of categorized way. You know, we don't go to the lists quite as much as a lot of the Buddhist world does. But if we're doing this, then we can understand from the beginning that it's a path, and that path starts with just how you're acting in the world. I think it's a really important point, and it's one that we can come back to over and over again, that Buddhism says, first, think about your behavior, before it says, get your head straight. And I point that out because I think there's a common misconception when we enter into a spiritual practice that's largely focused on meditation. There's this idea, I think, especially from the outside, that it's all about navel gazing. Right? And I certainly had this idea when I first entered Buddhism, that I needed to fix myself before I could do anything, basically. The way I internalized some of these teachings was that I was a kind of a dangerous person, right? Because I bought it just enough to buy the idea that I was deeply ignorant and confused, and that therefore I needed to sit down, face a wall, get out of everybody's hair, and somehow, magically, a week or a month or a year or 10 years later, stand up understanding how to be a citizen and go out and benefit others. I don't think I'm alone in bringing that kind of idea to this kind of practice. It's on one hand, it's just obviously not useful, but it's also, it's very kind of seductive because it gives you a way out. Right? Well, I don't have to participate because I'm not ready yet to participate. What I'm doing is really important and working on me. But if we look at it, that's really not being encouraged. It's perfectly okay from your deluded, confused, dukkha-driven mind to already consider how your speech might affect others and how your actions resonate in the world and how your livelihood fits into the larger scheme of things. And then from there, I think from engaging that, you naturally fall into this next body of questions, which has to do with how are you doing it? This is right mindfulness, right effort, right concentration. Right? It's in the category of meditation, but it's actually very outwardly focused in the sense of if I want to speak well, if I want my speech to benefit others, I have to start thinking about what I'm bringing to my speech. And as soon as I go there, I'm already in this next category of investigation. I'm already thinking about my intentions. I'm already thinking about the contents of my mind. And then, depending on who's talking about this, either you consciously then go into a pursuit or an exploration of wisdom, or option B, wisdom naturally arises out of those first two processes. In Zen, we don't talk so much about these three, but we have something that's almost exactly parallel, which is that when we talk about meditation, we talk about the body, the breath, and the mind. So the first thing that you do when you take up meditation is you take up the posture of meditation. You take up the specifics of how your body is relating to the practice of meditation. So you're focused on your back, you're focused on your eyes, you're focused on your hands, right? You're holding yourself in a particular way. And then once you've kind of settled into that, and you've found that, then you start paying attention to the breath. Right? So it's not just what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. Right? What are you bringing to the experience of this? Right? And then from a Zen perspective, we follow option B, which is you don't have to worry at that point about the contents of your mind. You don't have to decide that I want to think this way in meditation, or I want to have this kind of expansive experience of meditation, or whatever. That if you really commit to those first two, that is what meditation looks like. And you'll notice at some point that your mind has been taken care of through that kind of impersonal dedication. You have to try it. This is the very first thing the Buddha taught. He thought it was very critical that people understood this point. That we are working from not just I'll say kind of a dark place. Right? A pathology. That we are all working from a pathology. And the emphasis in a way being on all. That everyone is doing this. And you don't get to raise your hand and say, but not me. It's very analogous to the idea that in order to conquer addiction, you first must recognize that there is an addiction, right? You have to stand up and say, yes, I am an alcoholic, right? That's what this first teaching is asking everyone to do, to look carefully at their own experience, even just for an hour or for a day, to see how they honestly relate to the world. Whether they're a happy person or a sad person or an angry person, that's not the point. Not about feeling better exactly, but to be really honest about the experience of perception and what you are projecting onto the world. And to say, oh yeah, I do that. That thing the Buddha said, I do that. I do that a lot. Dukkha. So we roll back up. We haven't done the four yet. Those are the Four Noble Truths, but they're not the four seals. They're not the basic building blocks of Buddhism. Dukkha's done. Next one is impermanence. The founder of the tradition which I was trained in, Soto Zen, he says that if you understand impermanence, you understand the whole thing. And once again, we have the same phrasing, that all experience, or that everything is characterized by impermanence. Everybody's going to die. That's one. And so we can start there. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everyone that you've ever met is going to die. Everyone that you care about is going to die. Everyone you don't care about is going everything that you know right now wasn't always this way. And whether you live long enough to see it or not, it will not always be this way. And in fact, it's changing right now. And you are not the same person who came into the room, because now part of your life story is that you sat through this thing for half an hour. And before you came in, you hadn't done that. You're a different you. It's a really interesting absolute to put out there. There is nothing, from a Buddhist perspective, that will not eventually change. Doesn't mean that everything disappears, necessarily. There are threads, but those threads are based on change. You're based on change. Your relationships are based on change. I would say that you cannot possibly have a healthy human relationship without some basic understanding of impermanence. Because the person that you meet today is not going to be that person in a year. If you can't make space for that, that relationship is doomed. If I read these very dark articles about what the world economy is going to end up doing in relationship to climate change, and you get these articles every once in a while that point out that you should really enjoy your coffee now, for example, because 20 years from now it will be such a luxury item based on changing temperatures, and also the fact that eventually some countries won't want to grow it anymore because they won't be so poor anymore, and we won't be able to make them grow coffee for us anymore. That the ordinary person will not be able to afford to drink coffee. This is your chance. It's kind of fun to learn about those things, but they're just reminders of the underlying principle. That we don't get to keep anything at all. I think that Christianity often positions itself as the deliverer of the good news, right? And I sometimes kind of laugh at the thought that Buddhism seems to position itself as the delivery system of the bad news. You're mentally ill. You're going to die. Everything's going to die. It's harsh. But I think that there's a degree to which, of course, that's not true, because we have to talk about this. Some things that sound like bad news are not really bad news. But there's another degree to which I think it's very true, in the sense that sometimes you have that friend who's willing to tell you that hat does not look good on you, right? Buddhism is that friend. Dukkha, impermanence. Feel free to stop me anytime. The next is no self. No self is very closely tied to impermanence. We can't separate them out, but it's important to clarify so that we don't get it wrong. No self speaks to the idea that that nothing has an inherent existence. What does this mean? Well, in terms of how we usually understand our humanity in relationship to something like permanence, what it means is that from a Buddhist conception, we don't have what we might commonly understand as a soul. If we understand a soul to be kind of the light that we carry inside of us and that is with us from the time that we're born and takes us into the afterlife, and it never changes. It has an essence, right? Everything else can change, and I can grow old and I can experience disappointment or whatever, but there's this thing about me that's true. Buddhism says no. No, you might want it, but you only think you want it. Right? You actually wouldn't want to be saddled with anything that you had from the time you were born. As someone with kids, I can say this with real clarity. You don't want to remain 3 in any aspect of your existence. So that's one way of talking about it. And that, I think, for a lot of Western translators who first were talking about Buddhism, they would actually translate this as no soul. That's where we are, because that's where we get hit with that one. Oh man, I really wanted one. Right? But it goes beyond that. It says that there's nothing that is not subject to impermanence. Which is to say that nothing holds up completely as itself. And the example that I've heard multiple teachers use, and I don't know why, except there's some tradition of doing this, is a knife. That you look at a knife, and it seems so solid, and you can use it to actually inflict impermanence on other things. Right? But a knife was not always a knife. There is no knife that exists from the beginning of time or before the beginning of time. Right? It's made. And not only is it made, but it's made of parts. And it will not always be a knife. You may not live long enough to see it not be a knife. But no knife can survive foreverness. Right? And it's not limited to a knife, because you can use it as a screwdriver. Right? So its knifeness is completely provisional. It's a projection. We look at that and we say, this is a knife. And when we do that, we project onto it all our ideas of solidity and form. We say, this is what this is. It exists. It's real. Right? But in fact, it's in a constant state of decay right in front of us. And before that, 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 100 years ago, it was brought into being through all sorts of scientific processes and violence. Right? We're catching it in one moment. And we aren't even catching the knife at one moment in its lifetime. What we're doing is we're catching atoms, right, in a certain configuration that we call knife. And we think this is what this is. So no self is an insistence that we consider the possibility, at least the possibility, though Buddhism doesn't say it's a possibility. Buddhism is pretty clear about this, that nothing withstands this.
Is the truth of, could you say the truth of impermanence is like a knife?
Yes.
Is it impermanent or permanent?
Well, that's an interesting doctrinal point, because there are traditions within Buddhism that will insist, they'll phrase this very carefully. They'll say all conditioned things are impermanent, right? All conditioned things lack an inherent self. And in doing that, they'll make a distinction, and they'll say that there are certain things, then, like some kinds of truth, for example, or maybe they'll say enlightenment, or whatever that is. They'll say that's not composite. That's a whole other category. This gets into really interesting philosophical ground, but what it comes down to in many ways is the question is the essence of a thing the same as the thing itself? I come from a tradition that would insist that it's one and the same. That essence and form are exactly the same, that you cannot separate them. If that's true, and if the essence of reality is to be impermanent, then that means that impermanence is part of that reality, which means that impermanence is also impermanent. Right.
The two negatives make a positive?
What?
The two negatives make a positive?
Yeah. Buddhism is really into math. This kind of math, anyway, kind of inversion math. And likewise, by that logic, there can't be anything that is not subject to evolution and decay. There's a school of thought, certainly, that enlightenment, we have to talk about it, but it's hard to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. But that enlightenment, whatever that is beyond these basic principles. That because it's enlightenment, because it is what it is, because it's the whole enchilada, that it can't change. Because if it changed, that would be terrible, right? If enlightenment weren't inherently enlightenment, what would we have?
Wouldn't enlightenment be impertinent?
Wouldn't
it be subject to impertinence?
To impermanence?
Yeah.
Well, that's the question. And what I would say, personally, is that if enlightenment is as big as we say it is, and we'll get to that, and if it really is a reflection of our reality, and we say that it is that, then that means it has to change with reality. And that means that enlightenment includes cars, for example, and our experience of cars, and our relationship to cars, and the driving of cars, and the problems caused by cars. Whereas 400 or 500 years ago, enlightenment encompassed reality as that reality was. It isn't that one reality is bigger or smaller, but that if we're changing, reality is changing. And if reality is changing, within this stream, we'd say enlightenment also is taking a different shape. Right? It's like maybe it's just a blob. Let that not be the soundbite that you take from So we have dukkha, we have impermanence, and we have no self. And I'll just say one more thing about no self, which is that the question came up last week: can people practice Buddhism and another religion simultaneously? And what I said was that from the Buddhist standpoint, that's fine. That's completely okay. There's no concern about that. However, this one, the no self, is often, for a lot of people, that's the wall. Because it really does a number on your idea of the soul, on your idea of a God, on your idea of something eternal. This can be a game changer for some people. And other people come to it and they hear it and they think, oh yeah, I cannot find an exception to that in my own experience. That may be true. And it at least speaks to some of the value of this particular teaching, I think, that when we start looking for an exception to it, where we go is to invisible things that we hope are there. Right? Because no one imagines that the chair has an inherent self, once we kind of establish what this teaching is. No one imagines that this library has an inherent self, because we all walked down the street when it wasn't here. Right? But a soul, if it's there, maybe. If it's not there, that's where we go with this. It's hard. And I think it's a natural inclination to want there to be something we can rely on, something we can hold, some kind of ground. And Buddhism is fond of these kind of these phrases that are like, there is no safe place to stand. There is no ground. Buddhism loves that. Buddhism's your jerk friend, in that sense. And then number 4, I'll also mention, in some traditions, there are only 3, and we just got through them. But some embrace a 4th. And the 4th says, depending on how you word it, that enlightenment is beyond concepts. Or, also sometimes said that nirvana is beyond concepts. And what you'll find is that in Theravadan Buddhism, foundational Buddhism that you'll find in South Asia, for example, where people are wearing the saffron robes, that's the Theravada world. There's a lot of talk of nirvana. Nirvana is kind of the big thing. And in the Mahayana world, as Buddhism moved into China, and then from there into Korea and Vietnam and Japan, that we step away a little bit from that idea of nirvana and talk about enlightenment. It's really 2 sides of the same coin. One is talking about a kind of extinction process. One is talking about a kind of expansion process. They come together in this term emptiness that can really be translated either way. But in either case, we're saying that the big thing, the big intangible thing that's at the kind of the end of the Buddhist rainbow is beyond conceptual thinking. Now, why is that important, and what does that mean? It's hard to say, because it's beyond conceptual thinking. Right. So I'm not going to be able to craft a paragraph for you that really nails this. But it's worth looking at, and it's worth considering the fact that Buddhism would make this assertion, that it would single out this notion as something we should not forget. It's been really interesting in the last few decades to see that of the major world religions, the really science-friendly tradition has been Buddhism. And as we've kind of started to explore quantum physics, for example, people in those kinds of fields have gotten really interested in Buddhist teachings because they've noticed that there are a lot of Buddhist teachings that very closely parallel things that are only being discovered through the scientific process recently. And the converse is also true, which is that a lot of the Buddhist community has been really quick to kind of get excited about science. The Dalai Lama has famously said that if through the scientific process we were to undeniably disprove a Buddhist teaching, then Buddhism would have to change. Because from his standpoint, and I think from almost anyone's standpoint, Buddhism is intended to be a reflection of truth. And if we establish that something is true, and Buddhism is saying something that's contradictory to that thing that is true, that looks very bad for Buddhism. So what Buddhism needs to do, and seems to be very comfortable with, is to just simply say, oh, well, okay. We were wrong, right, and move on. It's also, I think, it's noteworthy that when we look at the 3 that we've talked about, impermanence and dukkha and no self, none of them can be subjected to the scientific process, to their conclusion. Whether that's intentional or not, I don't know. You can't really do a test to see if there's something out there that isn't impermanent. If you think about it, that's a horrible test. You would never know if you succeeded or not. Right? Same holds up for the other 2. You can't prove it. That doesn't mean they're right, but they're tricky. So I guess what I'm saying is that Buddhism is not at all opposed to or uncomfortable with the idea of dissecting reality and breaking it down into its components and putting it under a microscope and saying this is made of this. Not at all. It's actually really comfortable with that. And that kind of scientific method you'll see in a lot of traditional Buddhist teachings. There's a kind of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And therefore, it's a lot of it is actually presented in almost a debate language. But there's this assertion that comes out that even then, even though we're fine to do that, that no matter how much you pursue that train of thought, no matter how closely you look at things through that lens, the big picture is much, 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 much bigger than you think. So big, in fact, that to see it only from one angle is to miss it. So we sometimes have this phrase that enlightenment has no perspective. Enlightenment takes no perspective. Which is to say that if I'm looking at you from here, I'm not seeing all of you. In the same way, no matter how much I get it, no matter how big my epiphany is, that doesn't make me omniscient. That doesn't make me see the totality of things. Buddhism is saying the totality of things matters. The scale of things matters. The scope of things matters. And no one word is going to teach it. So if you just memorize Buddhist concepts, that doesn't mean you get it. And you'll find this horrible tension sometimes in Buddhism between practitioners and scholars. Scholars will insist that people who are purely practitioners don't understand Buddhism because they haven't read the 16 texts on this and they don't know how historically this became this, and that actually this teacher was, it sounds like he was saying this, but he was saying the opposite, right? Because now we have a new translation, right? And practitioners will look at that and say, the idea that you're trying to capture this in language is absurd. It's fundamentally absurd. Put your books away and go out and engage with your life. It really doesn't have to be one idea, I hope. But going back 2,500 years, you'll find scholars complaining about monks and monks complaining about scholars. Really viciously. Buddhists get mean just like everybody else. Those are the 4. That's what we get. I'm going to stop there for a second. Because do we need to talk about that anymore? This is huge. It's huge. Everything else that we talk about, if it doesn't reflect what we just talked about, something is screwy. It has to reflect this. That's what Buddhism is. As a body of teachings, that's what Buddhism is. And again, and I want to say this as clearly as I can, that does not mean that to practice Buddhism or to be a Buddhist, for whatever that means, that you have to believe what I just said. But you have to think, I think, that it is sort of intriguing. That it's worthy of exploration. That it's you know, that it might be possible and that might matter. And so if you're confronted with the idea of impermanence, if impermanence just hits you right in the face and you say, I don't care, that doesn't feel in any way jarring to me. or there's no aspect of my thinking or my lifestyle that I need to bring into accord, that I need to have better reflect this knowledge of impermanence. If you can't think of anything, again, this may not be your thing. Yes?
The more you're talking about Buddhism, the more it sounds like Buddhism is just a hypothesis of life.
Yes.
And it's just test this, keep testing it.
Exactly. Yes.
And so my question was kind of, where's the line for Buddhism? Like, what's the difference between a Buddhist and an atheist who happens to meditate every day? Like, how do you become a Buddhist or leave Buddhism? Or
It's great. I love the way you phrase that question. What's the difference between a Buddhist and an atheist who meditates every day? Well, the first response is, for many people, nothing. Because a lot of Buddhists are atheists who meditate every day, right? So, that can be just a straight line.
yeah.
But yeah, what if someone is coming to meditation maybe from meditation first, not coming at it from the perspective of these kinds of teachings, this kind of philosophical underpinning? At what point do they intersect with that? Buddhism would say, eventually, if you pursue that line of practice long enough, you'll eventually bump into the same thing. And as for this kind of more technical question of how does someone become a Buddhist, or what defines a Buddhist, I think that in our culture, for most people, a Buddhist is someone who just says, I'm Buddhist. I remember before I got married, I took a walk with my wife, Tracy, and we were talking about Buddhism, and she'd been interested in it for a couple of years, and she said, how would I know if I'm Buddhist? And I said, I don't want to make any decisions for you, but I think you might be. For many people, I think for most people, it's that simple. It's just a self-identification that hopefully is useful, but can also be a hindrance if it becomes a kind of cloak, right? But then there are ceremonies that take place within some traditions in which people have the opportunity to make a statement. Not on a large public scale maybe, but within a community, to say, I am committed to exploring this, and to exploring it with you. And that takes different forms in different traditions. But yeah, it's really easy to be Buddhist. No, it's really easy to become a Buddhist. I don't know if it's easy to be a Buddhist.
May I suggest a possibility for that first part of your question about the difference between the two? Wasn't it that the Buddha was asked something quite similar to whether or not there is a God, and he wouldn't answer? So he was demonstrating that he felt it was important not to take a position on that, whereas an atheist, depending on what kind, may be taking a position.
Maybe. Right, and atheist is such a not useful word, because atheists can simply not believe, but they can also actively disbelieve.
Right, so
right.
It's the kind of, there is a difference between a Buddhist and someone who says, I am an atheist.
Potentially. There are.
I mean, if he proclaims atheism as a true doctrine.
Atheism is pretty complex too. It's just not it's just not a monolithic thing.
Right. There are, however, I think 13 questions that came to be the questions you're not supposed to ask in Buddhism, and they mostly have to do with these kinds of the classic religious questions. What do I continue after I die? That's on the list. That's on the list of 13. Right. And depending on who's telling the story, sometimes the idea is that the Buddha sat there, when people would ask him these questions, and he'd sit there, and someone would say, you know, what happens to me after I die? And he wouldn't say anything, but he knew. Because of course he knew, because he's the Buddha. You know, it's like, I think for some people it's so inconceivable that the Buddha might also have been ignorant of some things that we have to make up this backstory in which he got it, but he just wasn't going to say, right?
But didn't he also further explain that the point why he wasn't answering was because the question wasn't conducive to what he
Exactly.
got?
Exactly. So, but the greater point is that there are these trains of thought that are not necessarily considered beneficial, and not only are they not beneficial, but they're kind of black holes, right? They're the questions that you can invest your entire life in without ever getting an answer. Yes.
So who those 13 black holes you just said? Who developed that? Were there other followers of the teachings of Buddha?
I think within the tradition we would say that the Buddha established the 13 questions that you don't ask. I think because there were probably 13 questions that somebody asked.